Hey everybody, and welcome back to a new video. Do you find that some of your photos aren't as good as you hoped, but sometimes you don't know what's wrong? Blurry, not sharp, lacking details, or just not interesting? As a photography educator, I get to see lots of photos and many of them with mistakes. Heck, I make them too. So in this video, I'm going to share the main problems I see with photos from beginner photographers in hopes that it can help you avoid these mistakes. And I'll show you how to fix them. If you stay to the end, I'll share the so-called problem in this photo that makes it very bad, according to some people. My name is Simon D'Entremont, and I'm a professional nature and wildlife photographer living in Eastern Canada. I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for nature photography. Subscribe if you want to see more. One of the things I see the most in beginner photos are blown out highlights. I see more than usual this time of year with snow on the ground. Blown out is the term we use to describe when parts of the photo are overexposed. This shows up in your photo as areas of pure white, like here. Now what causes this? This happens because your camera sensor's photo sites, or pixels, are exposed with so much light that they're overfull, beyond what's called the full well depth, or the maximum amount of photons that it can capture. This is analogous to a glass left in the rain for too long and is overflowing. The problem with this overexposure is that the details in those parts of the image aren't recoverable. They're pure 100% white with no details in them. That means that when you try to lower the exposure, you just get a darker white, which is gray. Compare this with a white that's very bright but not yet blown out or pure white. See here, when I darken the whites in processing, I can actually recover the details as long as they're not blown out. What's the moral of the story here? Expose your whites to be indeed white, but stop short of blowing them out. You can do this by darkening the exposure using higher shutter speeds, smaller apertures, or lower ISO. Or in semi-automatic modes like auto ISO or shutter and aperture priority, use negative exposure compensation to darken the image. Note that blowing out your highlights is represented on your histogram by touching the right-hand side. So make sure you stay clear of that. Leave a tiny gap on the right. Also, turn on blinkies on your camera. That's where your back LCD will flash showing overexposed areas. On a Canon, these are called highlight alerts in the blue menu. On a Nikon, go to playback display options and select highlights. On a Sony, look for settings for zebras, which are zebra lines. On a Fuji, display custom settings, live view highlight alert. Another major issue I see all the time is poor focus. That means that part of the image is in focus, but maybe not your subject. Sometimes your focus will be on something in the foreground, like this photo of mine. Sometimes something in the background, and sometimes on nothing at all. This may or may not be the photographer's fault. Many older cameras don't have the sophisticated subject tracking of modern mirrorless cameras, nor things like eye detection. As such, getting the focus point to lock onto your subject wasn't always easy. Lack of contrast on your subject, for example, can make it difficult to lock on, as some cameras rely on contrast and details to focus. Phase detection focus systems, for example, separate the subject into two phases and focuses to bring them back together. But what if your subject doesn't have the contrast to differentiate the two phases? Here's a tip. Place your focus points on the edge of your subject. That edge then becomes a more identifiable feature for your camera to split and then compare them for focus. Another trick to improve your focus performance is to pre-focus, especially in advance of acquiring a moving target. If you're having a hard time focusing on something, try focusing in advance on something near to the same distance as your intended subject, like a building or a tree. Then, when you try to focus on your subject, your lens is already close to the right focus plane, speeding up acquisition and accuracy of your focus. Now I just mentioned your subject being out of focus. What if the whole photo is out of focus and there seems to be little streaks everywhere, like the scene was moving while you took the photo? Well, that wasn't the scene moving, it was you. And that's our next common issue, camera movement. Your camera records the image onto the sensor by opening a shutter, and the light that enters while the shutter is open becomes your photo. But if your camera moves while the shutter is open, The light that should be registered on one pixel in fine detail is smeared to neighboring pixels. This makes the whole image lack sharpness and is recognizable by the whole image looking a bit streaky. A good way to avoid this is to use a tripod. That way your camera stays stable while the shutter is open. But if you're shooting handheld, a good rule of thumb to avoid this is to use a faster shutter speed, lowering the odds that movement will be a problem because the shutter is open for a shorter period. Since the image moves faster the more zoom you have on your subject, the technique needs to take this into consideration. It does this by the formula being 1 over your lens focal length to determine the right shutter speed. So for a 50mm lens, use 1/50th of a second, 1/200th for 200mm lens. A reminder that this corrects for camera movement, not subject movement. And finally, don't stab the shutter button. It moves the camera at exactly the time you want it to be very still. Press on it gently and actively try to stay still while taking the photo. Your image quality will improve as a result. Another common problem is not realizing the limitations of certain lighting scenarios, like trying to capture movement in low light. I get asked all the time why images are poor quality when shooting sports in a dark gym, photographing planes taking off at night, or dancers in a dark hall. Until you get first-hand experience, many photographers believe that any scenario can be captured well by a camera with the right settings. The reality is that light is a finite resource and that getting good image quality in the dark needs light, but getting fast shutter speeds for freezing action requires limiting the time the shutter is open to get that light. In these scenarios, you need to realize that you can't always get the settings you want to work. You need to settle for what the situation will allow. For example, for photographing your kids playing basketball, you may want to shoot 1/2000th of a second to freeze the action and use f8 to get everything in focus. But that will give you ISO 100,000, let's say, in some gyms. Even though it's imperfect, you may have to settle for 1/800th of a second, f4 with your lens wide open, and still your ISO might be 6400 and your image a bit noisy. And you can't use flash in most gyms, so you get what you get. I need to deal with this often as a wildlife photographer, as often the action is early and late in the day, and I can't use flash nor wait for better light. The wildlife will move on, so I do what I can do. Like this shot at a much too slow 1/15th of a second, f4 and ISO 10,000. It's not perfect, but it's what I had. I took lots of shots, many of which are blurry, but a few were good enough. By the way, check me out on social media, as I almost always include a tip with every post, and you can sign up for my email list, where you can download my guide for shooting backlit situations for free. For the next most common problem I see is that there was no effort put into choosing an angle from which to shoot. This leads to a very plain photo that doesn't get much attention or doesn't show off your subject in any unique way. When your photo looks like you just put the camera up to your eye and hit snap, it shows. Having a photo that is the same viewpoint, which is eye level, that everyone else in the world has, will have a hard time standing out in a crowd. Shooting down at a duck pond versus getting down low is an example. Or taking a photo of a lighthouse versus being in exactly the right place at the right time to capture the sun star is another. Be intentional with your vantage point to see a huge jump in the artistic quality of your photos. Line up something in the foreground or background with your subject, or get close to a foreground element, or get up high or get down low for a unique perspective that will show your viewer you put some effort into the shot. Remember, your viewers, by looking at your photo, can actually tell how much effort you invested in the shot. And I promised you a bonus tip. Remember I told you about this photo that was very bad? Well, this was my photo. And when I posted it online and shared that it was shot at ISO 3200, someone said, "Too bad, as now you can't sell it, as it doesn't have enough dynamic range." What a bunch of bullpucky. My last tip is that while you should work on your photography knowledge to always strive for better as a personal challenge, don't let people convince you that image quality is what makes photos great. The tips I've shown you will help you learn about how to continuously improve your craft and know how your camera works, but good images are good images, and no single factor like dynamic range or noise or sharpness will ever make or break an image on its own. This supposedly crappy photo of mine with only 7 stops of dynamic range is sitting proudly in my home. And this photo with also only 7 stops of dynamic range, shot at ISO 6400, is my best-selling print ever. After you've mastered the tips in this video, It's now time to bust the photography myths, which you can learn about doing in my video right here. I hope you can go out in your very next outing and put these tips to use and take your own unique and amazing photos. I know you can do it.